Hello everyone, my name is Genesis Tavares. Today I'll be presenting to you my presentation for my project for the class of PLA 4160 with Professor Smith. This is the title of my project, which is How News Media Affect Criminal Court Cases, Free Press, and No Fair Trial. This is my table of contents. This is just to give you an outline of exactly what I'll be talking about in my presentation. First, I went over my title page, and next I'll be discussing the introduction, which is consists of my research question, background, and previous literature. Then I'll talk about why this study is important. I'll also go over my arguments, which is consists of my thesis, counter argument number 1, counter argument number 2. I'll share with you guys my findings and then my conclusion. So what is the question? The question is, how does news media affect criminal court trials? So to give you some background information, my paper has to deal with the First Amendment and the Sixth Amendment. The First Amendment gives the protection to every U.S. citizen by the Constitution, the right to speech, and also the right to press. It can be said that this right is given to impose a moral duty on the press to keep the people informed, because as U.S. citizens, we have the right to know, we have the right to read, we have the right to acquire knowledge, but of equal importance and just as fundamental as freedom of the press is the Sixth Amendment, which is the right to fair trial. This means a defendant has the right to a trial that is free of even the suspicion of community hostility and local prejudice. Although both of these rights are considered basic and fundamental, it is inevitable that frequently the two do conflict. And even though the two exist side by side, as they must in both federal and state constitution, more often than not, the two clash whenever there's a case, particularly a criminal case, involves any amount of community interest and local concern. So previous literature here is the Demas Martinez versus State and Warner's versus State. So in an astonishing case of Demas Martinez versus State, the Arkansas Supreme Court overturned a capital murder conviction in part because of juror's Twitter's posts throughout the trial. And the juror failed to stop his Twitter activity even after being told that he was threatening the integrity of the trial. The court ruled that this behavior of this juror is just misconduct. He even called in question the fairness of the trial. The judges of the Supreme Court argued that it is no way appropriate for a juror to state thoughts or any information about the case in such a public fashion. And we can see how social media fosters juror prejudice by providing an easily accessible means to search or post information about ongoing trials. Another previous example of the rise of social media complicating the issue of juror impartiality is the case of Warner's versus State. The media branded Warner's as the first female serial killer in the U.S., and this turned into a huge theme. Her trial coverage, it was just big on television, and they made her seem as a man-hating murderer, and this really helped sway the public opinion against her. The sex role, stereotypes constructed by the media allowed the prosecution to build its case around the fact that, or the idea that women typically do not commit violent crime, especially against strangers, and it just made it easier. It made it easier for the jury to decide for the death penalty on her. So why is this study important? We know that not all press is good press. It's obvious that the most news outlets, not all of them, but most of them, either misinform the reader, slant a report in particular direction, they misquote, they unfairly interpret the situation, etc. And these are problems. These are problems of thoroughness and accuracy, of professional competence and integrity of criminal trials. The result in an inaccurate and incomplete picture of what is actually happening in the courtroom seems to be the principal sources of injury to the judicial system overall. Okay, I believe, classmates, I believe that our overriding concern as future leaders of the criminal justice system should be the press. And even when the press reports crimes and criminal trials with reasonable accuracy, which is very rare, um, this very process encroaches upon the constitutional right to fair trial by an impartial jury. Next, I have my thesis. So here, my thesis says, based on precedent cases, it is evident that the bench and the bar and the press news media are at odds in the effort to protect two fundamental rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution: freedom of speech / press, and the assurance of a fair trial. I firmly believe that excessive media coverage threatens to weaken the right to a fair trial and an impartial jury. So my paper, my whole presentation is basically arguing that media tends to abuse the accused. Media rushes to render judgment on the defendants, and they disregard the principle of innocence until proven guilty. And this is a form of injustice. And there are significant lessons to be learned about how common media routines and practices may jeopardize the presumption of innocence. But in my article, using the theory of prism of legal consciousness, there seems to be no limits on media speech surrounding high-profile cases, and an unrestrained mass media can often have a negative impact on the integrity of the trials. Okay, there has been a lot of neutralizing measures intended to affect trial fairness and kind of to mitigate the impact of unfavorable coverage on juries, but these are not always successful. So counter argument number one is the idea of educational value. I mean, there's a lot of arguments that has been put forward to justify the public airing of criminal trials by the press, but one of the main ones seems to be educational value, which says that the public can derive from an actual report of the workings of its courts through the press. And this argument is closely associated with the term the public's so-called right to know. And while this argument does deserve some weight as an abstract proposition, I say this as an informed citizen operating in a democratic society. It is hardly sufficient to counterbalance the adverse effects of publicity on the administration of criminal justice. Okay, so realistically speaking, press reports of criminal trials, they do not enlighten the public. There's little educational value in reports filled with half-truths and distortions. Okay. Counter-argument number two is pre-trial publicity does not affect our jurors. Well, it is argued that, and even though, okay, this is true, not all jurors, but the majority of the vast majority. And even though you can make the argument, oh, well, just go ahead and remove the jurors who have been contaminated by misinformation. Well, it's not just only that. In any event, whatever adverse effects the information may produce cannot be substantially erased from the minds of the jurors. Trial judges, for example, who have faced the task of selecting an impartial panel of jurors in a case which have been subjected to a widespread pretrial publicity, know the lingering doubts which exist even after all available protective techniques have been utilized. So my question is why should we have to tolerate the mere possibility of a contaminated panel of jurors when there is so little demonstrable benefits which flows from the disclosure of such information, and so much potential harm which may be inflicted on the defendant, the public, and even the administration of justice? And it should be pointed out, the only scientific data available through fragmentary supports the conclusion that emotionally charged news reporting is prejudicial. So what are my findings? My entire paper focuses on the case of Carrington versus Duke University. So to make the long story short, the Duke story gained a lot of attention because it had all the elements of a dramatic tale. It had to do with a black woman going into court saying that she had been raped by a handful of supposedly drunk, privileged, or rich white athletes who attended a top private college in Duke in North Carolina. So, usual media behavior would lead one to expect simplifying and sensationalizing of a case. But the media relied heavily on the stereotypes in constructing their narratives, and even the journalists themselves filtered information through their own stereotypes. And in the Duke lacrosse case, there was a vast majority of evidence that many in the media use a standard story script that viewed this event as a metaphor for larger cultural divisions, and they use terms as, race, racism, Black, white, African American. They even used they even said statements like white over Black, the privilege over the working class, and by racializing the story, journalists conveyed the role that racial difference continues to play in the United States, first of all. And then this narrative, like many others, places race in a context where racial hostility and competition are highlighted and perhaps even exaggerated. Such information is likely to undermine racial community. It was this racial element that actually motivated national media and audience attention to this local crime case in the first place. So with a long history of racial tensions, the news media had its field day. They were in a rush to cover the story, often with insufficient, poorly sourced information. Reporters even made assumptions that even turned out wrong at the end of the trial. The news media, being understandably jealous of their freedom of publication, are quick to resist suggestions that would tend to limit the scope of their operations. And it is only by complete understanding of the basic desires and purposes of each party to the conflict that the real problem can be discovered. So overall, my perspective on this is that there are positive and negatives to everything, even including the digital media. In relation to the criminal justice system, social media can aid the public in being kept up to date with arrests, court cases, missing children reports, staying vigilant, etc. But social media can also express harm by exploiting information before it can even be released, or leading for outbreak of massive crime, as seen in example, the George Floyd protest. Okay. So in conclusion, it's inevitable that these two amendments conflict. We all have the right to speech. We all have the right to the press. The press has its right, but defendants in trial, they also have the Sixth Amendment right, which is the right to a trial that is free from even the suspicion of community hostility and local prejudice. And more often we can see that jury is more likely to believe that the accused is guilty before even the trial even begins. So in conclusion, mass media does not always uphold the principles of morals that come with freedom of speech. It is fair to say that the media coverage can and does have a prejudicial effect upon the fairness of trial. Neutralizing measures that were designed to counter the effect of prejudicial coverage upon jurors are not consistently effective. Such values support rather than oppose restrictions on the media in the instance of speech prejudicial to fair trial. So I think the American courts, they're going to have to reevaluate. And they're going to have to place limitations on biased reporting. Okay, because it should be unlawful. And U.S. courts should consider the potential of enacting restrictions on the publication of inadmissible evidence as well, okay? Such as, past convictions and other material that might be significantly detrimental to the defendant. But that should be for both before and during the trial. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you guys learned something new. And yeah, thank you so much.